ourselves, and then once we're educated ourselves in our religion, then we can hope to think about educating others. There's a hadith from Imam Ali alayhi salam in Nahj al-Balagha. It's saying number 73. He said, "Man nasaba nafsahu lin-nasi imama, فليبدأ بتعليم نفسه قبل تعليم الناس قبل تعليم غيره وليكن تأديبه بسيرته قبل تأديبه بلسانه ومعلم نفسه ومؤدبها أحق بالإجلال من معلم الناس ومؤدبهم." In the translation he says, this is saying number 73, he says, "He who wishes to lead people must begin by teaching himself before he teaches others." Right? Start with yourself, then you can hope to lead others, teach others. He must teach others discipline through his actions before he teaches them through his words. He who teaches and trains himself is greater than he who teaches people and trains them. Alright, so if the crisis exists, we're hoping, claiming to be followers of Imam Hussein, who dealt with the crisis of his time by doing something, by taking action against the crisis, taking action to change the downward spiral, then our duty is also clear. There is this vacuum, there's a void in Islamic education amongst our own people, within ourselves. And so we can address this, and we must address this, right, by first educating ourselves, and then after educating ourselves, then we can start slowly with our families, with our friends, with our communities. And then, inshallah, once our communities are strong, then we reach out to other people and get them to know more about the religion in the right way. And then we have a support structure to help them through their journey into the religion. Recite the salawat, please. So what I want to do to try to address this, to try to help start this process of educating ourselves, is to see what we can do to educate ourselves about an aspect of the Qur'an. Right, the fundamental kind of source of knowledge for Islam is the Qur'an. But oftentimes we don't get beyond reading the Qur'an. We don't get beyond reciting the words of the Qur'an. Oftentimes we, almost like a ceremony, we'll read verses. If we're lucky, if we've done some work in tajweed or in good pronunciation, we might be able to pronounce it properly. But oftentimes we don't even do that. And then if we're a little bit more motivated, we might read the translation of it as well. But I think you'll probably admit this yourself, that we're shortchanging ourselves if that's all we're doing with the Qur'an. If that's the extent to which we're benefiting from the Qur'an, simply reading the words as a ceremony and then reading a translation superficially, then that's not nearly enough. That can't be the source of our religion. That can't be the foundation of our religion. So the attempt and the hope and the goal that I have right now is to take a part of the Qur'an. And I want us to spend these 10, maybe 12 days, probably more like maybe 10 days or 11 days, because on the day of Ashura we probably won't have these sorts of discussions. But to focus on one particular aspect of the Qur'an. That aspect is the story of Isa alayhi salam. I've done this a couple of times in other venues. I've taken a story of one of the prophets. One place in Chicago several years ago, I took the story of Moses. And the whole month of Ramadan, we went through all of the verses dealing with Musa alayhi salam. I brought them together. It was like a big puzzle. And you lay out these huge 1,000-piece puzzles. And that's what it was like. There are all these verses about Musa alayhi salam and the story about him. And I pieced it together chronologically to kind of give order to it. So you see, like, where did the story start, and then how did it progress chronologically until he gets to the end of his life. I did the same thing last Muharram with Ibrahim alayhi salam in Albany. So I'd like to do that same thing with Prophet Jesus. He's one of the Ulul Azm prophets, right? One of these prophets who brought a Sharia, or brought a new law for people. One of those prophets who was a prophet to all people, not simply to a particular nation. So what I'd like to do, inshallah, in the next, starting from next lecture, is to actually bring these verses together and then go through bit by bit. I'll have a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll just I'll flash up the verses in the translations, and then I'll speak to you a little about each of those verses, so we can learn lessons from these stories. By doing this, it's wonderful because what you find is a lot of the Quran is stories. And a lot of the Quran is composed of these stories. And if you get a handle of these stories, then you know a huge chunk of the Quran. Maybe more than half of the Quran is these stories. If you think of all the references, like sometimes you'll have like Surah Maryam, for instance, that we just recited a little bit of. Right, most of that's a story. Surah Yusuf, for instance, most of it's a story. But then other places you'll have references to that story too. So once you know that story and you have that whole puzzle kind of pieced together in front of you, and every time there's a reference to that, then you immediately the whole picture, the whole story comes into your mind as well. Right? So it's wonderful to have the bigger picture in your mind. What I hope will happen is that this story will become kind of like, again, part of the fabric of who we are. I don't know if you've experienced this. How many of you have watched the Message? Probably most of you, and most Muslims have probably watched that. And if you're like me, I remember when I was growing up, I must have watched it multiple times to the point where I probably knew the dialogue, and it really became part of me growing up. That was the only film that we had. We didn't have all these other cartoons and stuff 20 years ago. But that movie played such a great role, I think, in educating a lot of Muslims and maybe non-Muslims as well about the personalities of those people. And when you think of Hamza, for instance, right? Like whenever you read about Hamza or mention Sayyid al-Shuhada Hamza, right, you think of Anthony Quinn. You think of that image of Hamza, those conversations he had with the Prophet, those brave feats that he had. Fortunately, unfortunately, Anthony Quinn turned out not to be such a great person in real life, and that partly may hurt our image. So there's a disadvantage to having this linkage between personalities and these characters. But the point is that things like that, like movies, stories, right, they have the potential to form the backbone of our understanding of the deen. Right, we're constantly searching for role models for ourselves, definitely for our kids, to show them someone and say, look, this is who you want to be like. But sometimes it's hard to show them because we don't have good films. Now we're getting them. We're getting there slowly. We don't have good movies and good films to show them about the Prophet and the Imams, to say, this is the Prophet, this is the Imam, this is what you should aspire to be. We don't know necessarily the companions as well as we should of the Prophet or the Imams. But they're outstanding personalities amongst the companions. If we know their stories, then their stories they kind of become part of the background of our culture. Right? So you can start having allusions to remember the story of Malik, remember the story of Kumail, remember the story of Isa alayhi salam. And just a little reference like that all of a sudden conjures all these images in our minds because it's become part of our common fabric. Right? Everyone knows the same story. To the extent we have that with Imam Hussein. Right? Most likely because most of us have grown up with Imam Hussein, hearing the stories, knowing about what happened at Karbala. To an extent we have that with Imam Hussein. Where I could probably mention a hadith, and even if it's Arabic and you don't know Arabic, you'd probably ring a bell and you'd figure out where that fits into the story. Right? It's really important. That's building our culture. Build our culture, build a fabric of our culture around these personalities and these teachings. Right? That's the goal, inshallah, that I want to try to address and inshallah accomplish to some extent. There's one thing to keep in mind with the Quran. When we're trying to study the Quran, it poses some challenges for us, especially if you're not familiar with Arabic, or even if you are familiar with Arabic. Unless you kind of learned how to benefit from the Quran, it's not a very easy book to use. That might seem unusual or strange to you. If it does, we can talk about that some afterwards. But it's the reality. I don't know if you've had this experience. So you open the Quran and you expect to have to understand everything. It's a clear book, we should all understand it. But it sometimes it's not the case. So you open a book and you read a verse and